My name is Martin Bunton. I am currently the interim director at the Center for Global Studies. I'm filling in for Oliver Schmidtke, the director, who, like others out there, is on a sabbatical, on a full-year research leave. And it really is a tremendous pleasure for the Center for Global Studies to host the Property Rights and Society discussion group that Andrew Buck organizes. But before I turn it over to Andrew, who's also an associate fellow here at the center, in addition to teaching in the law school here, let me do two things. Let me quickly thank our team at the Center for Global Studies, Kayla Klim and Jody Walsh, who have been tremendous supporters of this discussion group over the last year, and necessary support for the whole Zoom apparatus. Thank you, Kayla and Jody. And also let me, of course, acknowledge that although we come together virtually from many different parts, sometimes of the world, let alone North America, that the university and, for example, from my own home, from where I'm speaking, that we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, as well as my own home, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanik peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. So let me turn it over to Andrew. Andrew will introduce our speaker. My thanks to Dan for joining us. And then Andrew will also moderate the discussion afterwards. So thank you to Andrew and to Dan and to all of you. Welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thanks very much, Martin. Well, it's a particular pleasure today to have Dr. Daniel Rück, who will be talking to us about his just published, hot off the press, as it were, book. And what a wonderful book it is. For those of you who have not seen a copy, here it is. And having seen it, your fingers should be eager to go online and order your own version. And the reason why you should be thinking about doing this is that there's been, over the last few years, a lot of really quite exciting research that's been published on the question that the book covers about dispossession across Canada, about the relationship between settler colonial authority and Indigenous peoples and Indigenous legal orders. But I felt that Dan's book is really quite exceptional in terms of its approach. A number of things struck me about it when I was reading it. One was the fact that Dan positions himself as the author and makes a point, a very strong point, about how a researcher from a settler colonial perspective can do justice to a topic like this. And it's done, I think, in an incredibly thoughtful way. It's also, and one of the things that we've done in the past presentations is that we've looked at scholars who have got recent books that have approached the question of dispossession from different disciplinary perspectives. And Dan's is wonderful in that it's a sort of multidisciplinary approach to this. It's a combination of legal history, of environmental history, of study of Indigenous legal orders. It combines all these in really quite a seamless type of way. And the other thing is that because we've approached scholars talking about their work from different parts of the world and different jurisdictions, that this is the first time that it's become local. It's the first time that we've got somebody talking about their contemporary research on unceded Indigenous territory that we're all sitting on at the moment. And so it's a particular pleasure to be able to introduce Dan. And just very briefly, before I hand over to Dan, just a simple housekeeping question. I wonder if at this point, everybody could turn off both their video and their audio for the duration of Dan's talk. And then at the end, when I open it up for questions, if at that point if you have a question, could you turn your video back on? That will then alert me to the fact that you want to ask a question, and we can proceed that way. But from this point on, it'd be really great if everybody could turn off their video and their audio. So without further ado, and with great pleasure, I'd like to hand it over to our speaker, Dan.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Andrew. And Martin as well. I'm really thankful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And in fact, your research group sounds amazing. And the topic very much interests me, and the interdisciplinarity of it. It sounds really inspiring. So thank you also for reaching out to me. And for the wonderful introduction to my book, the really good words, and also for asking people to buy it. What a nice thing. Great. So I guess this is the Zoom version of having a spotlight on me and not being able to see my audience. So I'm just going to consider myself on a stage here. But before I go into my slides, I just want to talk a little bit about my relationship with Victoria and the University of Victoria, because when I was thinking about it, I realized that the most extensive time that I ever spent in Victoria was about 15 years ago, when I had a mostly Francophone Victoria experience, the most French Victoria thing you could ever imagine. I was a student in the Explore program. And so as I was preparing this talk, it struck me that I live in a country that's willing to finance 5 weeks of language study for a language that's really not spoken in that place at all. I believe that the program introduced us to every single French speaker in Victoria, and it really was spectacular. And for someone who lived and studied in Montreal, as I did at that time, and I studied at an English institution, McGill, at the time, it really strikes me how expensive that project is, and how ridiculous it is, and potentially how artificial it is, but how determined we are as a country to spend money and to make sacrifices so that we have both of these colonial languages, to some extent anyways, across the country. How much money was spent on me learning an Indigenous language of Vancouver Island? Zero, which is also exactly how much I learned about anything Indigenous in that program. I had a really great time in Victoria improving my French, and there's lots of things about Victoria I like. And I love that I'm now able to work and live in a bilingual context, thanks in part to government financing. But this story is also a reminder to me about what reconciliation could look like if we put our money where our mouths are, which is a part of what my book is about. And I hope what I've tried to express through this book is that hope, that this broken relationship that we're talking about and the reconciliation that we're hopeful about is something that can eventually manifest itself into something real. So the book is about a broken relationship, an exploitative relationship, an abusive relationship, but it's also about like how the relationship came to be that way, a relationship in which trust was broken. But let me back up here and share my screen. Does everybody see that? So this is just my introductory slide here. There's not much to say, but I am going to go on to the next one. And to give a land acknowledgement, and also like a law acknowledgement, I guess, if I'm going to try to riff off the title of the book. I think of this book itself as a land acknowledgement in the sense that one of the things that Andrew pointed out is that it's kind of personal in the way that I write about it. And so I really do think about this book in a sense as like a years-long effort to acknowledge the land and the territory and its history. And I try to think about my land acknowledgements when I give them in that way. So I want to give kind of an extensive discussion of that here as I start talking about my research. I did much of my research on Haudenosaunee or Haudenosaunee territory when I lived in Montreal, and also in Algonquin territory once I lived in the Ottawa-Gatineau area. I lived in Montreal when I completed my PhD at McGill, and I also did some work on this project while living in the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people when I lived in Toronto as a postdoc. I wrote and reworked much of the book living in unceded Algonquin territory while living in Gatineau and working as a professor at the University of Ottawa. Who I am is also an important part of my acknowledgement. This has become important to me as I started to dig into my own family history, which is deeply entwined with the British and American settler colonial invasions. First into Ireland, which is something that I just learned about, that you know, once I saw people's birth dates and death dates in Ireland, who then came on and went on to places like Kentucky and the Illinois country. And on my father's side, with the 18th century settler colonial invasion of German farmers into areas of Hungary, newly acquired by the Habsburg Empire at the expense of mostly Slavic farmers and ranchers. And when they were in turn dispossessed in the 1940s, they became refugee settlers who eventually found their way in the 1950s to Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territory in what's had become known by then as the province of Alberta. And I want to thank also some of my teachers and mentors who guided me in this work, particularly today Ganawage elder and scholar Brian Deere, Elspeth Heeman, my PhD supervisor, Ganawage friends, leaders, and historians, including Deon Wiesande and Garhowane, people who were really influential in this work. So I talk in the book, I start talking about relationships of laws and land as a way to think about this history as I was beginning to write it. The Laws and the Land is a history of Canada Indigenous relations that focuses specifically on the relationship between Canada and Ganawage, a Kanien'kehá:ka or a Mohawk nation near Montreal. And I frame the book with my own experience as a white settler man scholar who first learned about Ganawage through the colonial archives, namely RG10 or Indian Affairs collection at Library and Archives Canada. Like so many white men, missionaries, engineers, educators, police, anthropologists, and historians, I went into Ganawage. And many before me had gone into Ganawage with those professions, and many of them had gone in with the idea that they had all the answers. And in the colonial context, people like me have caused a lot of damage as a result. And it really doesn't matter what our intentions were. I think many intentions were actually quite good, but it doesn't matter because there was so much harm that came of that anyways. So I framed the book around my own desire to tell the story of the relationship between Canada and Ganawage while listening to the people in Ganawage. This may sound like common sense, and I agree that it is. It's absolutely essential that settler scholars, historians in particular, listen to what Indigenous people have been telling us for generations about colonial harm. When they said residential schools caused harm, they were right. And when they said they were subjects of medical experimentation, they were right. And when they said treaties weren't respected and still aren't being respected, they're right. And when they said genocide 50 years ago, they were right. And even a few years ago, when I thought that word sounded extreme, they were still right. And when they say that stories matter and that their laws matter and that children matter, they're right. even just having to make such commonsensical statements about people's humanity makes me uncomfortable, but I feel it's important, just as it's important to say such commonsensical things as Black Lives Matter, because we still live in a white supremacist world. And so this book is a small contribution, I hope, to the kind of scholarly history that respects Indigenous voices while critically examining the archival evidence in the colonial archives. By the way, the image that you're looking at is a satellite image of Gunawage. And one of the reasons why I use this image is because it shows you don't need to have a map to see the outlines of this reserve. You can see the kind of triangular shape of the reserve, even though you don't have a map in front of you. All you have is a photograph, and that's because laws and history have environmental impacts. The land has a history, and the land in relationship to its inhabitants have a history. And so when you see that straight line of the Montreal suburb of Châteauguay, which is on the left side, and you see the straight line, and then it's forests and golf courses, and the darker green color inside the reserve, that's because of history and because of laws. It's because of the Indian Act, and it's because of various things intended and unintended. You can also see different kinds of agriculture on the outside and less on the inside. So but that's not something that specifically that I'll be talking about here today, but it does come up in the book. So settlers have been coming to Gunawage for centuries with agendas, and their actions often caused incredible harm, and their agendas have not always been to explicitly to harm. I think it's actually relatively unusual that a settler explicitly said that they were trying to cause harm when they went into situations like this. But even many well-intentioned settlers did great damage because they weren't willing to listen or to take Kanien'kehá:ka points of view seriously. Sometimes it was white men who married into the community and then refused to live according to Gunawage laws so that they could enrich themselves. And I write about that in chapter 2. Sometimes it was missionaries who preached their truth rather than listen for the truth of others. Sometimes it was storytellers like me, anthropologists, historians, journalists, who came with their minds already made up and saw what they wanted to see and reported back their, quote, findings back to their audience. It was also Indian agents who imposed their agenda and also the agenda of the Department of Indian Affairs, or the DIA, as I refer to it here. Or sometimes their own personal agendas as well, and meddled in every aspect of Gunawage lives. In the period covered by the laws in the land, the DIA was defined by paternalism. Officials projected an unshakable certainty in Indigenous peoples' helplessness and savagery, and in their own ability to identify and solve Indigenous problems for them. In writing this book, I strove to avoid this colonial hubris, but I also acknowledge that I may have failed in ways that escaped my attention. As a white cisgender man living in a settler colonial state defined by white supremacy, heteronormity, and patriarchy, I continue to cause harms in ways that I don't yet fully understand. But I've tried to remain accountable to Gunawage Rono, or the people of Gunawage, in ways that I hope make this book more valuable, helpful, and true. So I've got here a slide here that shows one of the images from the book, a beautiful map sketch of the village of Gunawage in the early 18th century. And this was during the French period, and this is held by the National Archives in France. And it was quite the adventure to get it, actually, but that's for another day. It's a good example of the kind of early colonial legal relationships that I discuss as sort of a starting point in this book, in the sense that there was a kind, I think this is on on a large scale, broad sweeping generalizations, I agree with the historian Richard White that there was a kind of middle ground in this earlier colonial period where both the colonial governors and settlers had to, and also indigenous leaders and diplomats had to learn about each other and had to meet each other and had to learn how to speak to each other in each other's symbolic languages and also in their actual languages. So it was very common for settlers to learn indigenous languages and vice versa. And it was very common for settler leaders, for example, to use indigenous metaphors and indigenous diplomatic methods and ways of speaking when they were trying to negotiate. And same with indigenous people at the time were interested in European ways of doing things and were ready and willing to adapt certain things if it made sense to them. So, but this image here shows a French depiction of the village of Gunawage, and what it shows is a whole bunch of longhouses where Haudenosaunee lived. At this time, it would have been about 1,000 probably. Somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 probably. And then it shows this fort on the right-hand side, which, it's quite a detailed sketch of the fort with its church, with those red buildings. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to have this map printed in color, but the red buildings show structures that were actually completed. And so you can see that only part of the wall of the fort was completed at the time of making of this. And in fact, these are the only things that were ever constructed. So the yellow parts were never built. And in fact, the wall that's depicted around the town, as far as I can tell, was never really built either. So this was very aspirational, but it's like a lot of colonial cartographical depictions. It shows something that was hoped for by colonial administrators and probably also to impress their superiors on the other side of the ocean about how in charge they were. But in fact, colonial officials, a good example of this is the colonial officials spoke about indigenous villages as mission villages or as villages of les domiciliés, which is, it's a little hard to translate into English, but it's the domiciled indigenous people, and they would often refer to them as les Indiens domiciliés or les sauvages domiciliés. So it's very strange. The word savages in French was used a lot longer, well into the end of the 19th century in a way that it wasn't in English. So, but it is interesting that they would use these kind of a term like that, a domiciled, as in like these are the people, the indigenous people who are sort of safe, or they're with us, or they're going to stick around. There's all kinds of baggage that comes with those kind of words. So, and then the word mission villages suggests that the villages were defined by missionaries, that the villages wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the missions. And in fact, from indigenous points of view, the missionaries and the mission itself was to some extent, and for some, I think it was quite important, and for many others, it wasn't all that important. These were indigenous villages, nations that were located near French settlements, and they were often comparable in size. For example, Gunawage and Montreal had roughly the same population in the 17th century. So these are not insignificant places. And it's hard to make counterfactual arguments, but if it weren't for these villages, if it weren't for these indigenous people who were willing to ally with the French colonies in the Canadas would never have lasted as long as they did. The French simply didn't have much of a population here and relied almost to a huge extent on indigenous firepower to protect their settlements. But of course, these settlements were also protecting themselves, so they were very self-interested as well. These communities would often allow missionaries to live with them and to build churches, and missionaries considered them, most of them, converts but were also often frustrated by the continuation of Indigenous ceremonies, law, sports, and other traditions. And then I can show you here this isn't like core to the argument of my talk, but it's a friend of mine did this on his computer. He just took that image of that particular fort and village and juxtaposed it on a satellite image of Gunawage today. And you can see that today it's that really important historical site is people's houses. People live there, and some of these houses are very, very old, and some of them aren't. And you have swimming pools, and this is the church is there. And recently, one of those old walls collapsed that was around the fort. So this is like living. This is living history here. I want to talk just a little bit about legal pluralism. Many of you work on this kind of a topic, so I'm sure you're familiar with it. But I just wanted to mention too that during this time, up until the end of the 18th century, a modicum of respect was definitely to be seen between Indigenous nations and settler society. And with that modicum of respect came a more balanced economic, cultural, and demographic situation. Jan Grabowski and other historians have written about the way in which Indigenous law was generally applied to Indigenous people. So Indigenous law was applied to Indigenous people, and colonial law was generally applied to settlers. And this was the status quo until the end of the 19th century, which is the first time that an Indigenous man, and in this case, a man from Gunawage, sued another Gunawage man in a colonial court. And so that's one of the chronological starting points for the story that I tell in the book in terms of an invasion. So I want to talk a little bit about invasions. The Laws in the Land tells the story of a settler colonial state, Canada, operating on Indigenous lands and its invasion of one Indigenous community, Gunawage, that was just living in a tiny portion of its vast traditional territory. The invasion described wasn't conducted with soldiers and guns, although the threat of military violence always lurks. When one of my mentors read this part of the book, he said to me, this isn't like theoretical violence. We were attacked in 1990. They came for us. They surrounded us, and they were here to kill us and to take our land. So it's really, really not theoretical for people who lived through the Oka crisis, and there are many, many other events like that. It was an invasion of, the one I was describing in the book is an invasion of colonial values and laws, headed up by bureaucrats, Indian agents, politicians, land surveyors, and businessmen. It's a similar battle that also raged within the community itself, as Ganawage people of Gunawage, disagreed about how to respond to colonial advances and how best to defend their nation. The book is thus a story of colonial interference in Indigenous lives, rooted in the idea that settlers and settler governments have all the answers and license to do what they want to do to Indigenous people. Colonizers believed that it was their right and their duty to impose their laws on Indigenous peoples and lands, even while Indigenous peoples continued to assert their own laws and values in the face of a colonial order that was at best indifferent and at worst murderous. The Laws of the Land is an account of colonial harm, and I really emphasize this in the book of this isn't just a story that I'm telling where I'm going to tell you both sides of the story. It's also a story of Indigenous resistance to settler colonialism, of an Indigenous nation that collectively refuses Canadian laws and rejects the conditions imposed on it. Certainly don't always agree on how that's done, but there's certainly an overall rejection. But the focus of the book is on colonial invasion. How are colonial laws imposed? How does it occur? How does the transition, what does the transition look like? What happens when people don't know which laws apply? What if some people continue to live by indigenous laws while others adopt colonial laws? How does the state respond to indigenous refusal and resistance? These are some of the questions that I've explored in the book, which presents an indigenous community governed by its own leaders and laws that in various circuitous ways and chaotic ways comes to be partially governed by Canada under the rubric of the Indian Act. So the image that I have on screen for you here is part of a document that I write about in the book, which is a document that the chiefs of Gunawage wrote. These are traditional chiefs. These were chosen. These were men chosen by their clans, by clan mothers, in a traditional way. And this is the kind of leaders and government that was replaced by the band council system later in the 19th century, against the will of the community. So what the chiefs here were responding to was this incident where one Gunawage man, Arakwande, took another Gunawage man to a Montreal court, sued that man, and it was unprecedented, never happened before. These were the kind of disputes that were always resolved internally according to Gunawage law, which is based on Haudenosaunee law, the Great Law of Peace, the great tradition of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And so, well, of course, one can imagine why someone like Arakwande would want to do that. He was a business person in the community. He felt like an outsider. He was born Indigenous, but in another community, and had been adopted into the community of Gunawage, may have felt like an outsider, but was in some ways quite a successful business person, ferry operator. He ran an inn, seems to have been involved in lumbering as well, and that's what got him into this situation where it was a dispute about land, where he felt like the laws of Gunawage were not in his favor, and he could do better by appealing to colonial law. And so first of all, the chiefs wrote letters and appealed directly and in person to all the powers that be, that everyone in Montreal that would listen, to say, like, we've never done this before. There's no place. This is our dispute. This is our internal dispute, and your law has no bearing on us. Your law doesn't apply to us, and it doesn't apply to our land. They said that really explicitly. And they saw that the courts still heard the case, and there kept being more of these other. There was a couple of other people that got involved in similar situations. And so the chiefs wrote this 1801 document, which is a list of 21 rules. And when I wrote about it in my dissertation, I wrote about it as I called it the 21 laws, because I really wanted to think about these things as laws. And then after speaking with legal historians about it, especially Philip Gerard, I started to think of it more as a legal code. And it's more of this cohesive document rather than as a list of laws that don't relate to each other. So I'll just give you some examples of some of the articles. There's 21 articles in this legal code, and it was very much an assertion of these chiefs who said, this is our land, our laws hold true in this land, and we're going to write them down because you don't seem to be listening to us. So they started with Article 1 and 2 are basically saying this is our land and our laws apply here. We're sovereign, and we as the chiefs are the ones who have the right to speak for the nation and to make decisions, and these are our responsibility. It's never said explicitly, but very much the tone of this is that the settler government, that the colonial government has no role to play in this community governing itself. So these ones here, since this is a group that discusses property rights, I thought I'd list these articles here that are specific related. Article 3, as the lands of the said seigneury, so this is, I haven't mentioned it, but Gunawage was, according to the French, founded under the seigneurial system with a seigneurial grant from the King of France. So it's often referred to as a seigneury. As the lands of the said seigneury of Sault-Saint-Louis are held in common by all the individuals who make up the Iroquois Indians, including children adopted by the nation, it's agreed upon that each and any one of them shall not hold nor distribute more land than they can clear without putting another person in their place to do the work, be it a farmer, agent, procurer, or other. So this is a law that explicitly states that no one's allowed to own more land than they can work themselves. And it's one of those laws that I sometimes think about what the world would look like if this kind of thing actually were enforced around the world, and what that would mean for capital accumulation and land accumulation. I mean, it would be a very, very different world. And it's really this kind of, it's not that this community is against trade or capitalism necessarily, but it's when it comes to land, it's really explicit that someone should not be owning more land than they can work themselves. And so there shouldn't be capitalist land relations, essentially. Article 4 says it shall not be permitted to any individual holder of land in the said seigneury to sell or carry away any firewood or timber, the whole being reserved for the individual's use and for the use of each member of the village in general. As it shall not be permitted for anyone to cut maples of sugar bushes of any owner without their express consent. So here, this is another really important law that I write about in the, or legal principle that I write about that was asserted by Gunawage chiefs throughout the 19th century, which is that anyone, member of the community, citizen of the nation, was allowed to cut wood anywhere on the territory. It belonged to anybody, firewood or timber. And outsiders were excluded from this, but also it's quite explicit that this doesn't include sugar bushes and a couple of other kinds of wood that are mentioned later as well. And here the principle is that sugar bushes are being used in this very particular way, and so a person can claim ownership over them in a way that that you can't with other kinds of wood. And I use the word ownership there quite freely, more freely than I should, loosely, because as you all know, Indigenous conceptions of relatedness to land don't, or almost never, I think in almost never, I'm going to say almost never, but I'm tempted to say never, in Indigenous contexts, can they ever be expressed as ownership, right? So, and I think what non-Indigenous people can misunderstand in that is that kind of relationship to land means that Indigenous people don't have any relationship to territory or don't have any right to particular bounded areas. And we know the English language is so awkward to talk about this kind of thing about anyways, because our language is the the language that invented capitalism and capitalist land relations. So of course our language has difficulty speaking about land in any other way. And so I want to just acknowledge that I can't properly address the complexity of Indigenous relations to land in this. So when I use the word ownership, please put it with an asterisk. I'll read you another couple of, I realize I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to actually skip the next couple of articles here and get close to the end here and talk a little bit about what I'm calling here, as I was preparing this talk, I decided I'm going to just throw cadastral invasion on here. I didn't use the term in my book, but just thinking about it in terms of mapping and in terms of property relations, one of the things I write about in chapter 6 is the way that Canada's invasion unfolded over time. And in chapter 6, starting in the 1870s and 1880s, Canada focused on this cadastral invasion, which was through land surveying and the establishment of private property on the reserve, which this was an attempt to completely redistribute land and to impose Canadian private property and agricultural norms on the small territory this nation had left. So here you can see the work of the Canadian land surveyor, William Wallbank, who went in and, by the way, these white lines on here are ones that I drew on top of this map to show. It's a really complicated map in Library and Archives Canada that was made in 1885 and is very damaged, as you can see. And the white lines are the ones that I identified as the property lines that Wallbank drew out. He also has other things that he's marked in here, including land use. But he spent years on this and thousands of dollars of Ganawage's own money, which they were unable to prevent the government from spending on this project. And so eventually they used the entire band fund, over $24,000 of the money at the time, and it was almost all spent on this survey against the wishes of the community. At the same time, while chiefs were being refused to spend their own money on their own priorities, like helping poor people to pay for funerals of loved ones and that kind of thing, that the Department of Indian Affairs refused to let them spend money on. So you can see sort of some of the harm that comes from that. This is a project that was, again, of course, it was framed as being with good intentions. And here you have this really complicated cadastral map that's dubious even in its accuracy because it was done by an outsider. But it is the basis for the cadastre today of the land relations in Ganawage. So it has this huge impact. And then, so I've got it here a little bit more simplified. And then what they wanted to do, and I use this, I show this, some of you, if you've seen me give a talk before, I showed this before of what Canada wanted, because I think it's just so telling, it's so clear to me of what property relations Canada wanted, even with the simplification that they'd already done with the map that's shown here. They wanted it to be much more simplified like this. And so Wallbank's map includes this, and this was the projected distribution of land of like every Ganawage person, by which they meant adult man, and a few widows would have access to these 30-acre lots, which the whole idea was that they would all become farmers and that they would then all become enfranchised and cease to be Indians. And then the reserve would no longer exist. So this is all part of a larger story of the Canadian government trying to extinguish Indigenous nations through the Indian Act, through land redistribution, through this kind of carrot and stick approach of like, look, you might get a farm if you stick with us. And so the community really like opposed this on every level. You know, even when there was the odd time when like one person would maybe agree to go along with it, and then the incompetence of the department made it so that this couldn't go forward. So this is a story of both active harm and also like harmful indifference and incompetence that I talk about in the book. Of the ways in which the bureaucratic incompetence can also lead to further harm too, because it's just this whole process was incredibly disruptive to people's lives. Whoops, here I've got a slide that's a little bit, I must be at an angle here because it's slid off to the side, but it's not very important what's off to the side. This is an image of Gunawage today. You can see this incredible imposition of suburban and urban infrastructure. You can't see the hydro lines because they're behind us, but you've got railroads and you've got this very, very busy Mercier Bridge and all the approaches. And that's the core of the historic Gunawage village behind there, and the St. Lawrence Seaway also on the right, which severely disrupted people's lives. So when people, I think when I watched the Oka crisis or the Ganasatake resistance in 1990 as a kid, it just seemed to come out of the blue for me, but for people who experienced all this, it's not out of the blue. This is just like, that was just like a series, one in many events that led to that. So by way of concluding here, I just want to talk a little bit about frontiers. Historian, and I write about this in the book a bit, historian Patrick Wolf makes a useful distinction between two kinds of frontiers. He describes the demise of the frontier, capitalized, or like the things that we think about with massacres, removals, armed conflicts, as a moment when, quote, elimination turned inwards. So that's the demise of when the frontier ended, then the frontier had to go inward. It wasn't the end of invasions, but simply the beginning of another kind of invasion. So the end of the frontier, capitalized, was the end of a particular kind of settler territorial expansion, but just the beginning of countless new frontiers and forms of invasion into Indigenous lives and land, as well as Indigenous resurgences and assertions of sovereignty. If we wish to understand Gunawage, and everywhere really, as part of a frontier where Indigenous people constantly confront all manner of settler colonial forces, we have to put aside the heavy burden of the stereotypical frontier, a lawless West where cowboys and cavalry battle Indians in a tragic, endless, repeating dance of death. The settler invasion can occur in any geographic location, and it never really ends, as we know it thus far. Instead, the invasion turns itself into bureaucracies, systems, and mindsets, hiding its true self behind justification stories, failed memory, and bald-faced lies. As such, settler colonialism is a profoundly modern phenomenon, not a historical land-grabbing prelude to a modern reality. And it shouldn't be conceptualized only as a struggle between Indigenous peoples and settlers, but it also as a tension within the minds and hearts of settlers and Indigenous people alike. So the frontier in the laws of the land isn't a geographical boundary or an ambiguous space of conflict between Indigenous and settler cultures, but rather the narrative unfolds in the space where Canadian colonial governance and law meet Kanien'kehá:ka governance and law. This book is a legal history because it shows how two legal traditions interacted, or even three legal history traditions interacted in a colonial context. Anishinaabe legal scholar John Burroughs argues that Indigenous legal traditions have always been practiced in the country currently known as Canada, and he summarizes Canada's long tradition of recognizing and affirming the existence and legitimacy of Indigenous law. Burroughs sees Canada as a legally pluralistic state where, quote, civil, common, and Indigenous legal traditions organize dispute resolutions in different ways, though there are similarities between them. So in this way, and the way that I'm describing it in the book, Canada is a place where different legal traditions are constantly interacting and where ancient Indigenous legal orders come into contact with newer settler legal systems in many ways over time and space. So what I'm describing is an ongoing invasion. I'm describing this frontier that's both on the ground, it's lines on the land, it's also a frontier that's inside of people and between people and in events and times and places. So to Ooh, okay, I didn't get to show you this one. Got to get more organized. That's not very useful at this point, but I wanted to talk about this one where I reached out to a Gunawage artist named Kyle Williams and talked to him about possibly using one of his paintings for my book. And as you know, book covers, I don't actually have very much experience with publishing, but I think I understand that book covers are sort of a complicated space where the publisher doesn't want to leave it up to the author to choose the book cover or the image, because I think we probably make really terrible mistakes a lot of times if we were given that, and the publisher certainly doesn't want to let us. But they really want our input. So I was, I purchased this image from Kyle because I was like, I think this will work for the cover of my book. And of course, like a friend of mine says, well, it looks like it's for a book about, you know, 20th century architecture or something like that, Bauhaus or modernity. But what I think he was probably right, and it wasn't appropriate. But what I saw in it was the potential to slightly alter this image of which is looking up at the Mercier Bridge, which is a view that people in Gunawage have every day as they're driving around. This is like, as you're commuting to work, you go under this behemoth. And so he drew these kind of two intersecting highway approaches. And what I saw in it, if you could just alter the colors a little bit, if you could make the sky a little whiter, and if you could make the bridge approaches a little bit more purple, you'd be able to see distorted two-row wampum. On the left side here is an image of the two-row wampum, which is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, known treaty between Indigenous people and Europeans. It was conducted between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch in the 17th century. And it's representative of two boats going down the same river. One is the European ship, one is the Haudenosaunee canoe. Sometimes people speak about it more largely as Indigenous people and settlers, sharing the same river, but not interfering in each other's business, right? Nobody's trying to steer each other's boat. These lines never meet. And so I thought, well, this image sort of encapsulates what I'm trying to say in this book of like, wait, these lines aren't supposed to meet, and they're like getting distorted and meeting each other in all these ways and interfering with each other in all these ways. So it was a great conceptual idea. The press didn't think it would work though, sadly. So I ended up with this one, which is okay. I'm actually quite happy with it. And it shows this nondescript man, white man, presumably, who is maybe a land surveyor, maybe a business person, who knows, sort of standing on this railroad track that I write about in the book, and overlooking the village of Gunawage. And I really liked the way they brought in the wampum as sort of a conceptual background for the book cover as well. Have no idea what they were doing with the typeface, but somehow I like it, so I'm okay with it. So with that, I want to say Nyawa and Miigwech, which are thank you in Ganyenge, and also in Anishinaabemowin. And I'll also say thank you and merci as well.
Thanks very much indeed, Daniel. Well, I open it up to questions. I'm sure there will be questions because there was so much that was covered by Daniel's talk. I can see, as is usual, it won't. It'll actually be John Lutz who has a question. John, your audio.
Oh yes, that Zoom curse of the mute. Yeah, sometimes I wish we had the capacity to mute others when we're doing different kinds of interactions. But so thanks very much, Dan. Great to see you. I guess Andrew, in introducing your book, suggested that one of the things that struck him particularly was how you positioned yourself as a settler scholar and doing Indigenous settler relations in the book. And you did a little bit of that in your talk, but I wonder if you could say more about those challenges. As you can tell, where I'm coming from as a settler scholar who wants to imitate the good work you do in Indigenous settler relations. So.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, John. And nice to see you as well. But speaking of imitation, John's work has been also really inspirational for me. I see you as someone who's really been doing this kind of work and really been like struggling with the challenge of what it means to be this person and to do that work. Yeah, this is hard because it's actually really difficult for me to talk about how to do it right, because I don't think that that's maybe the right question. And that's the question I think a lot of people ask, and it's the question I ask sometimes too, but I think when I ask it like that, then I'm getting off track. So I think the right way maybe to ask the question, and is, for me anyways, is to say what's the right way for me, for who I am in this place where I am, and for this work that I'm doing. So I think I really hesitate to suggest or to even write like a methodological piece or something to say like, you should do it like this is the good way. Because for one thing, I don't think I've done everything right, that's for sure. And the other, I think lots of people, there would be plenty of critiques for me in Gunawage if people were speaking their mind. But on the other hand, I think what does, none of the answers that I'm coming up with really like are gonna work. So it's very much about like what Indigenous people talk about with some of these principles. If you look at Indigenous research methodologies and you look at the principles always revolve around respect and reciprocity, and those type of concepts that are, and I've tried really hard to think about that. And it's been quite the challenge because, as you know, when we're working in colonial institutions and working with colonial, I use the word colonial just in terms of like, when we work with a shirk grant, for example, we have to follow certain rules that aren't made for this kind of work, generally speaking. I think people who are involved in shirk are trying to make space for it, but it's going to take some time. And same with our institutions, right? Our institutions are built on extraction of knowledge from Indigenous communities, and then scholars like me building a career off of that. So trying to move towards research methods and relationships that are all about reciprocity, where everyone benefits, is one of the things that I'm still trying to learn, especially as I'm transitioning to new projects right now. I'm really trying to think carefully about where I'm going to next. And here is one of those places where I can present to people based on relationships that I've established already in Gunawage, but also other places. What do you think about this project? Does this seem useful? Is it something that can benefit your community? I think that's one thing that's really striking me now when I think about projects that I'd like to get involved with. I think 10 or 15 years ago, I was more just interested in what was kind of cool and interesting to me. And I think now I'm really like, I still have that and being like, that would be really cool to work on that. But I'm like, my life is only so long. And if I'm going to do things that really matter, I really want to focus on things that are really going to make a difference for the communities that are most impacted by my work. So I would say that's, I think, what I'm able to do better now than when I started this project.
Thanks very much, Dan. I think I'm sure you've done a good job, and I look forward to reading the book. I think for me, when people ask me that question, I also struggle to answer. But I think ultimately, my answer comes down to good intentions and good heart. And if you have those going into the project, sure, you'll make maybe some mistakes, but they hopefully won't be so egregious as they otherwise might be. And on the reciprocity front, this is something I always struggle with as well, how to give back to communities. And, if you write a good book that helps Indigenous people with their struggles, well, that is a form of reciprocity, although not one that maybe everybody in the community sees right away and appreciates. Have you maybe in your future projects or on this last project, developed sort of ways of reciprocating, but beyond producing a lovely, powerful book?
Yeah, like the book, nobody asked for this particular book. So it's, you're right. That's, I do think that it's going to be useful in some ways, and it may also be harmful in some ways that I haven't anticipated. I think that's always where we're at. Just to come back to your first question, it just strikes me that one of the concepts that I didn't mention was accountability, and that's something that I've tried to build in, where the way that our system is set up is that professors are only accountable to each other as part of the peer review process, and we're accountable to the university, and we're accountable to basically peer review and our colleagues in our departments, but we're not accountable to other communities. So I've really tried to build that into my research methodologies, and that's sort of part of it. But in terms of reciprocity, as a historian, one thing that I certainly do, and one thing that I can quite easily do, is to be available when people contact me with questions that maybe aren't things that I care about, but it's things that they care about. I'm sure you've encountered that kind of thing too, where someone will come to me and say, I have this piece of land and it's this is the lot number, and I hear that you have some information on it, right? So can you tell me a little bit about like what the Wallbank survey said about that? So that's like an example of like a really easy way to provide that. The larger giving back would be to find a way to share that kind of digital information with Gunawage institutions in a way that makes it accessible to people from the community. That's something I'm still working on. But generally speaking, making the research that I do available, stuff at Library and Archives Canada is not very easily accessible to people. A lot of people don't read handwriting. A lot of this stuff is in French. People in Gunawage, most of them don't speak French. So this, one of the reasons why I translated everything, all the French quotes in the book into English, was to make it more readable for people from the community itself. And I put the original quotes in the footnote. So that's more an example of accessibility, but also maybe an example of reciprocity in terms of like, I really want this not to be about just about myself. I really want this to be about a relationship. And when a community is involved in some kind of blockade, or involved in trying occupying a piece of land, as they are right now, to try to stop a neighboring city from building a new residential development on their land, and they ask me for help in terms of historical documentation, I'm glad to do that work. It's hard sometimes because it's not going to be rewarded in academia, but that's the kind of work that builds trust, and I think it's the kind of work that's important in the final scheme of things.
Daniel, could I just ask a question about one of the slides you used from the legal code in 1801, and Article 4 about timber and about the rights of the owner. My memory of going through the book is that I think it's chapter 5 that you talk about the relationship between timber and the legislation, and you sort of flesh out those things in chapter 5. I was wondering, could you just sort of give us here today, a sort of sense of who the participants were that found themselves on opposite sides during those disputes. Like you'd mentioned, for example, white settlers who'd married into the nation, but then sort of led their own life separate to it. And I'm just wondering who these participants were in those disputes and why on different sides.
Yeah, I don't get into it in a really big way, but those of you who know about Gunawage a little bit will know that one of the big things that often comes up in the news about this community is about their, what they call the membership controversies. And this has to do with questions about who belongs and who doesn't belong, who has citizenship under the Indian Act, who has citizenship under the rules of Gunawage, and it's a really complicated web. And that has its origin in the story that I'm telling, which is in the book, it's about land, right? So the Department of Indian Affairs doesn't really care about who is part of the community and who's not until they face these kind of disputes where some people are claiming that this person doesn't have the right to own land and the other person does have the right to own land. And so this, what I'm pointing at is the origin of this attack on Gunawage sovereignty, which is the right to decide who's in your community and who's not in your community. And so what I'm able to show in chapter 5, I think especially is the ways in which certain people who were not Indigenous or were not considered to be Indigenous in the community were able to get support from the Department of Indian Affairs, were able to live there against the will of the people whose land it was, and against even the rules of the Indian Act, because the department kind of refused to take any action on that. And they tended to also be the people who were trying to accumulate land and were trying to impose outside colonial ideas of who owns wood and such, right? Most of us wouldn't think that you can go to a neighbor's lot and cut their tree down and burn it in your furnace, right? That's very much, we're very much used to the idea that if a tree is growing on your land, that that's your tree as well, which in Gunawage didn't hold true until that was imposed sort of more or less violently. So yeah, what you're pointing at is these disputes. But the other thing that I want to talk about in response to your question is about the way that these questions were often racialized, so that when settlers thought about who belonged in the Indigenous community and who didn't, they would think about them in terms of race. They would think about who's an Indian and what fraction of Indian they were and what fraction of white they were. And then sometimes they even called people who were mixed race, half-breeds or Métis. And so some people in the community would call them white and some people would call them mixed race. But then there are lots of examples of some really traditional people in the community who didn't think about membership that way, who didn't think about citizenship that way, who really thought about citizenship as people who were considered to belong and who abided by the rules. People who lived according to Gunawage law, perhaps they'd married in, and that's the way it always worked. Haudenosaunee communities are kind of famous for having these really intense adoption, being very good at adopting outsiders into their community. And it's only under these colonial conditions that became a problem. So I don't know if that answers your question so much, but maybe there's a specific incident that you wanted to talk about, Andrew.
No. That did answer my question. Yeah, no, thanks. Okay, good. Jeremy.
Hi, Daniel. One question that I haven't been able to read your book, so unfortunately I can't work from the broader argument, but I am interested in your reflections on what you see as the interaction between relationship to land and economies of the people of Gunawage. It really quite struck me that the code that you described tended to focus primarily on agricultural pursuits. The ability to control particular tracts of land are tied to their agricultural use, even their use as sugar bushes. And I wonder, is that a function of the period you're looking at being a time when already Gunawage is extensively hemmed in? And so the kind of use of a broader territory is no longer current in the community because they've lost the relationship to hunting territories. And I guess I'm also wondering about whether there's any intersection at all with another phenomenon that was quite characteristic of Gunawage, which is pretty extensive participation in economies at a continental scale. First, integral participation in the fur trade. And of course, in recent times, more recent than the times that you're looking at, extensive participation in the construction trades throughout Eastern North America. So I'm kind of wondering about the economic base for the relationships to land that you're examining.
Sure, thank you for that question. One way to approach this question would be to talk about it in terms of the clearing and the forest, which are kind of traditional Haudenosaunee ways of categorizing space. So the clearing is the space where the village is and where the agricultural fields are, and traditionally governed by women, the village space and the agricultural domain. And the clearing, the forest is the part that involves men going out to war and involved in diplomatic and external trade and that the kind of stuff. Actually, a lot of the stuff you're describing is usually described as being part of the forest, the fur trade, men going out on these long trips, sometimes years-long voyages to the Hudson's Bay, or being involved in in colonial military expeditions to Egypt and Arctic expeditions, and heavy involvement in steel construction of skyscrapers. So that's traditionally, those are the kind of gendered spatial divides in Haudenosaunee societies. Now, what I've described, though, is very much the clearing, which at this period, like you said, this is a bit of a community that's hemmed in. Normally, these communities would move every generation, right? People would leave the village behind once it started disintegrating and would go build somewhere else and farm new fields. And that was no longer possible anymore at this time when these laws were written in 1801. The last time that the village moved was in 1716. And arguably in 1755, there was another move of a breakout group going and founding Akwesasne. So that's a bit of background in terms of where we're at. You can see the gender norms are changing during this time, where the men, the chiefs who are men, are taking responsibility for what had previously been a feminized space, the space of women's responsibility. So, but yes, men are still going out and hunting, but the late 18th century are a period of crisis for a lot of Indigenous communities because their hunting territories are now full of settlers who are also hunting and fishing, and the game becomes really scarce at this point. So there become a lot of sort of conflicts about that. But then people in Gunawage, a lot of the rules are actually about livestock as well. I didn't show you any. There's a bunch about pigs and horses and things like that, and how you're not supposed to milk someone else's cow. So that also takes the place of hunting to some extent, right? So if you want to have access to meat, then domestic livestock becomes an important replacement for hunting, even if hunting is still occurring.
Could I call on Peter?
Oh, okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Danielle, for your introduction and your acknowledgement and your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm wondering if you could explore, I don't know how much you explored it in your book, the whole issue of mapping as a colonial tool. I was really struck viscerally by the overlay of the linearity of basically a suburban map overlying the, that intentional straight line linearity with the actual reality of the way that the community chose to organize itself within that. But the extent to which mapping itself as a tool becomes something that both distorts and can be aggressive in terms of land takeover, in the sense that view of mapping itself.
That's something I struggled with in this project, because I'm working with colonial maps, so these are not Indigenous made maps. There are very few Indigenous made maps from that era on this territory. So yeah, maps are an important space of, they're like, as you know, they're text like any other, and they're quite powerful because they visually depict truth in this way that's kind of hard to argue with. And so that's one of the reasons why colonial mapping has been so important and effective, and one of the reasons why people continue to talk about it, I think, and continue to believe in these maps, right? So we were shown these maps as kids about what Canada is and how it grew, and how Indigenous people didn't exist, and that these lines are real, and that these colors are real, and we believe it, like collectively, right? Because they're such powerful metaphors, at least for those of us who care. So yeah, that's the struggle, especially knowing that someone like Wallbank, the surveyor who made that particular map, didn't have good relations with a lot of people in Gunawage, so a lot of people lied to him about where the boundaries of the land were. A lot of people went out and destroyed his boundary markers, and a lot of people made fun of him and hated him and tried everything they could to try to disrupt his work. And that's the person's work that it's this guy that I'm using his information to tell me, oh, that this lot has this much hayland and this much sugar bush on it, right? So how reliable is this guy? It's one of those things that we don't have any answers for. And so I feel like it's that kind of data is so important, and it's big, there's a lot of it, and it can be useful, but I think it always needs to be read with an asterisk next to it.
Yeah, thanks. I think you're right, and it also mapping also gives a capacity for external control in terms of what's counted in those maps. People disappear, resources are identified, like you say, his map identified resources in particular areas, and so that's an opportunity for exploitation, right? And
that's it. You're right. So that's the important point, that this is a bureaucratic exercise of trying to assert control from far away, and maps certainly and cadastral surveys certainly facilitate that. So yeah, to some extent this succeeded in that, and in other ways it didn't succeed in that, and people kept burning down the places where these materials were housed and things like that. So it's definitely an attempt, and a partially successful attempt, to try to get control over property relations.
Yep, great. Thanks, Daniel.
Rod.
Mute button.
Last meeting I was in, I couldn't find the mute button at all. I do want to thank you very much for the talk. Very illuminating and very helpful to me. I'm reminded this last discussion of the wonderful book by Hugh Brody called Maps and Dreams. and the way in which that was really, as I see it, an attempt to make that transition from the dreams which define, in a sense, the territories for the nations in northern BC into the maps which can be used for negotiations within the colonial settler legal landscape. So in a way, I guess it's a way of making that link from the traditional understanding for pragmatic purposes, perhaps for the indigenous nations to work their way through what is still the dominant colonial landscape. But I really wanted to just take advantage of the opportunity to ask you, since you've looked so deeply into the law and you're reading The Great Law of Peace. About 25 years ago, I came across an article referring to the Great Law of Peace as a constitution written by the people, of the people, for the people, and for generations yet unborn. And the comment was made that when the US Constitution was written, they got 3/4 of it right, but they forgot this important environmental or intergenerational justice question. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you've seen that gives credence to the claim that reading can be given. I made a note at the time that James Youngblood Henderson might be a possible source of that reading, but I'm wondering whether you see any foundation for my being able to claim that this fourth dimension to the Great Law could credibly be argued.
Ooh, big question. Thank you for it. I can't, and I won't try to answer that question. But what I would say is that that some of the principles that are in the Great Law of Peace, which are these really these principles of reciprocity, these principles are around long-term planning and thinking carefully about relations with other than human species, are there and get passed on to people in Gunawage who are never, I've never seen it in the colonial archive. I've never seen anyone in Gunawage in the 19th century referring to the Great Law of Peace. They don't say that in their correspondence with Canadian officials that we believe in the Great Law of Peace. But that doesn't matter, I don't think, in the sense that it's deeply a part of them and how they think. And they are surely telling that story and passing on those principles to their children. And certainly it becomes more explicit in the 20th century than when people in Gunawage start asserting that more explicitly. So that's something I really appreciate that comes through in even the 1801 code, is this focus on sustainability and on future generations and on trying to prevent capital accumulation and accumulation of land, while supporting and saying nothing about trade, right? That was not part of what the chiefs were interested in when they put this together. They didn't care how people traded goods with each other. There's nothing in there about that. So I wouldn't even say that they're not preventing capitalism from happening. They're only interested in preventing this accumulation of land that they see as sort of the death of the nation.
Thank you.
Well, I noticed that we're running out of time. Is there a last question out there? Well, Daniel, there isn't a last question, but there've been some fabulous questions before the last question. On behalf of everybody, I want to thank you for a great presentation, some really thoughtful responses to the questions. And I if nobody took the hint at the beginning, just let me remind you what the book looks like. So thank you very much indeed for the presentation. And yes, and it was really great. And I look forward to discussing it with colleagues after they've purchased their copy and read it.
Thank you very much, everybody.